Um, Kamran Bahari, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri.
No, I was telling you, I really appreciate you making yourself available. We're recording this on Sunday, October 15th, so more than a week since the initial attacks took place in Israel. Before we start today's conversation, I'd love for you to just give us a quick background into who you are, what you do, and what your specialty is.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. So essentially, I'm a geopolitical intelligence analyst by occupation. That's sort of my, experience, my skill set, my tradecraft. I spent a lot of time in the private sector intelligence analysis business. I was with a company called Stratfor for many, many years, for about a dozen years. And then I joined a successor group called Geopolitical Futures, spent some years there. I have a PhD in political science. What else? I'm Canadian. And I'm a co-founder of the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. It's a think tank we established. We worked on it for quite a while back in the 2016, 2017 time period. But its current iteration really launched in very early 2019. And we have grown. I used to be the director of analytical development at the New Lines Institute. But recently I took over a new responsibility called Senior Director for the Eurasian Security and Prosperity Portfolio. And basically, we're a small boutique think tank in Washington that doesn't do advocacy, unlike different think tanks that advocate for a certain policy outcome. We like to do, the intelligence gathering, the analysis, the forecasting, and then distill policy recommendations from that exercise. Obviously, we don't want to conflate what ought to happen with what is happening and what will likely happen. We tried to be disciplined about that. But yeah, we like everybody else, we operate by certain values. We want a better world, but we try not to make that sort of the starting point of the conversation. The question is that if we understand what's really going on, then perhaps we can chart a path towards a better future. But we have to be disciplined, and that's sort of our ethos.
Well, that's why I brought you here today, Kamran, because the process that we're going to use to figure out what's going on here and the larger regional implications is very important. So let's start there. Can you summarize for us? As I said, we're a week out from the initial attacks that took place in Israel that started this, or that ignited this latest round of violence. Can you summarize for us what we know at this point about the events of this past week and where we find ourselves today?
So what we have right now is an unprecedented attack by Hamas, and supported by Iran, Hezbollah. There is a serious uptick in Hamas's offensive capabilities. They between 1987 and 2004, they were known for suicide bombings. The Israelis were able to neutralize that in 2004. And then, they tried their hand in governing and ruling. But by the time they took over Gaza and imposed their rule there in 2007, they were well underway in terms of developing rocket capability. Now, that continued from 2008. We've had several wars, 2008/09, to 2012, 2014, 2021. But now, this time around, last weekend, the last about 7 days ago, they displayed something that we've not seen before, which is this complex operation involving hundreds of militants that basically broke through the barrier, staged an operation that went from township to township, and killing Israelis and whoever they could find, and basically doing all this, preparing for this kind of operation, while remaining below the Israeli intelligence radar. That's very different. That's a tradecraft that you don't sort of just acquire by looking at YouTube videos, or it's not one of those mail order kits that you get and then you can train your people. That's a specific tradecraft. It requires a lot of planning, preparation, and of course training of people, and to be able to do that and not be detected that you're planning such an operation means that you've gotten help. You've just upped your game, and like I said, this is signature playbook of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, the overseas operations arm of the IRGC, and of course, Iran can't parachute into Gaza, so it needs that medium of Hezbollah. So most likely, this stuff was planned and prepared in Lebanon. Then they did their training in Gaza, and then they executed it. So now what we have is a new reality. This isn't your normal Gaza war that happens every few years or has been happening since 2008. And it's become an intolerable threat to Israel's national security. And we now have something which is, a regional war in the making. Unless somehow, Iran can be pressured to remain out of it. But everybody has constraints. All the different players have constraints. The Israelis have constraints. Their issue is, how do you neutralize Hamas without killing Palestinian civilians? That's a conundrum. Iran has helped Hamas do this. Now, if it stands aside and lets Hamas, get neutralized and destroyed, then its credibility amongst its proxies in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, they're going to begin to think that when the going gets tough, do the Iranians just sort of sit back and let the proxies take the hit and secure themselves? So this is a very dangerous situation. In all of this, the Biden administration is trying to, is working that diplomacy machine to try and see if there's a way out of it and minimize the risks of conflagration.
So I want to emphasize something that's obvious to both of us, which is that there's so much uncertainty right now. I mean, this is a very fluid situation. And in fact, even the Israelis took some time to assess the scope of the damage that they took with that initial attack. How long, to that point, how long did it take for them to actually realize and come to an understanding of how big that attack was and to begin to respond to it? How off guard were they actually caught?
I mean, if you look at the fact that so much carnage was possible, that Hamas was able to engage in so much death and destruction before they met resistance from IDF forces, and IDF forces swung into action, tells you how off guard they were. I mean, and there are reasons for this. Look, first of all, intelligence agencies, security agencies can't be on like a 24/7, 365 state of red alert for a long period of time. There's exhaustion sets in. So there's that natural element that we need to factor in, and it's not something that there is any good solution for. You can mitigate by rotating people out and have a duty clock and whatnot, but at some point the other side is looking for those chinks in the armor and the opportunities to exploit, and they do find one. So that's number one. Number two is, I think that Hamas deliberately sent out signals, deliberately engaged in perception shaping that, hey, we're not interested in another Gaza war. And I think that sort of that was misinterpreted by Mossad and IDF. The other thing is that there was a cadence that was set in. If you look at the idea of rocket attacks, there was a cadence, there was a pattern. And the Israelis were not expecting anything else. So if you're Israel and you're looking at this and saying, what is the worst that can happen? Rocket attacks. And so they prepare for that. They were not prepared for this kind of an operation. And therefore, you sort of start to look for things that you are used to in terms of a threat perception, and you don't look for the anomalies. It is quite possible, and we'll just have to wait and see when we learn more, when the investigation completes its cycle, and we find out that where the balls were dropped, but it is possible. It is, we can't rule out the possibility that it was zero intel. There was some intel. There had to be some intel that was disregarded.
There were reports circulating that the Egyptian foreign minister or the president or the prime minister alerted Netanyahu to the imminence of some kind of attack. What do we know about what those reports were?
I've seen those reports. I don't have too many details on it as of yet.
Netanyahu's office denied it, correct?
Yes, they've denied it, but there's also a political imperative to deny such things because it's politically costly. Maybe the intelligence wasn't. We have to understand what the Egyptian imperative here is in actually saying this. So they know that they're going to have to deal with the fallout of this counteroffensive that Israel is going to engage in or is engaging in Gaza, and this is going to be nothing like we've seen before. So it's a regime change, essentially, and regime changes are messy. The Egyptians want to be sure that that their interests are secure, that they're putting pressure on Israel. This is their way of putting pressure on Israel. So we just have to wait and see. But look, there are always signs that are missed. But more importantly, intelligence is a twofold process. There's collection and there's analysis. More often than not, the collection is pretty good. The collection happens electronically. There are human sources, there's satellite imagery, et cetera, and you just sort of keep collecting. At a lot of times what happens is you have more intelligence than you can actually process. And processing is a human, if you will, endeavor. It's a human activity. And you can't, this is why, I think AI can be a great researcher, but it can't analyze. It needs that human touch. So I think that there's also a tendency to sort of fall in love with our analysis. We all do this. We have a net assessment. We basically say, hey, this is what I know about this actor or this place. I know how it ticks, and I'm pretty confident about my assessment until something happens, and then your net assessment is blown out of the water. But that's another element. But I think that there was also this idea that, hey, Gaza's logic, we understand, it's rockets. And we have the tools to manage it, but we have a problem in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority is essentially in meltdown mode. The president, Mahmoud Abbas, is 87 years old. There's no clear successor. There's bitter factionalization. There is massive corruption. We have Jewish settlements there. We're also thinking, and over on this issue, there's a divide amongst the Israelis as well. There are the far right actors are saying, let's go and annex parts of the West Bank. But then there's pushback from those who don't agree with that. So you have a very messy situation, and you're saying, can Hamas exploit this? I actually wrote a piece for Geopolitical Futures on this very issue less than 48 hours before the Hamas attack.
I read that. It was a great piece.
And so I said, this is the reason why, this is one of the drivers that is propelling the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to engage in negotiations with the Netanyahu government, despite sort of, all the risks and whatnot, because it's such an important issue. So the Israelis were looking at the West Bank. They thought they had the Gaza under control. They knew what was going to happen, what's the worst going to happen, and we can deal with it. So I think all of these factors explain sort of, and Hamas, obviously I mentioned the tradecraft aspect. That's sort of the big, I think the most important thing that we need to focus on is this new spike in terrorist tradecraft, insurgent tradecraft that was not there before. And so between the two, and they're also looking for sort of these opportunities. They're looking that the Israeli public is divided, the Israeli government is having a problem, it's affecting their military posture. So all of these things basically led them and their Iranian patrons and Hezbollah to say, hey, you know what? This is the moment to pull the trigger. And that's why we're here where we are today.
So you've mentioned a number of things that I've wanted to touch on. One is the political backdrop in Israel heading into these attacks. Another one is the relationship between Israel, especially the Netanyahu government, Likud party, and Hamas, and what they have done to facilitate the position that Hamas now finds itself in because of the political expediency, and pitting it against the Palestinian Authority and Fatah. So let's start with the political backdrop in Israel. What is that political backdrop for people that aren't familiar with the situation, and how do you feel that that could have contributed to the situation that the IDF found itself in on whether it was Saturday morning, I believe, was that the official time that it occurred, Saturday morning Israel?
The early hours of Saturday morning.
Yeah. As people were dissipating from a party. So what is the relevance? What is the political backdrop in Israel, and what is the relevancy of that here?
Look, I mean, you have a very unprecedented situation inside Israel. The political divide between the left and the right has always been there. The two things have happened. First, on the left weakened. Why did the left weaken? Because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really intensified since the intra-Palestinian civil war between Fatah and Hamas after the 2006 elections. In 2007, you had two de facto Palestinian authorities, Hamas controlling Gaza, Fatah and the officially recognized PA controlling the West Bank. After that, you had the rocket attacks, and the idea that we can actually negotiate, we being the Israelis, can negotiate a settlement with the Palestinians just wasn't there anymore. I mean, that argument could no longer fly. That was the argument of the left. If you remember, as late as, as far back as 2000, there was an effort on the part of then Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat was still alive, and he was leading the negotiation, mediated by President Bill Clinton.
At Camp David, the Oslo Accords.
Exactly. And so the idea was, hey, can we reach a final status settlement? And so that wasn't possible. But that was the left's position, a two-state solution. On the other hand, the right basically splintered. One of the reasons why the right splintered is that, and this is, before the Hamas took over Gaza. This is like we're talking now, 2005. In 2005, you had then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon of Likud, who was a powerful figure, and he
former
had
general,
a former general, a known, if you will, hawk, who decided, you know what, I'm going to do something that no Israeli prime minister has done, and I'm going to try and solve this problem. My first step is to go ahead and unilaterally withdraw from Gaza. Okay, we don't need to be there. We have neutralized Hamas's suicide bombing capabilities. They seem to want to now be focused on the political mainstream. They're trying to take advantage of the fact that Fatah and the Palestinian Authority is weakening. So this is the best thing to do. That was a very controversial move. I still remember footage from those days where IDF soldiers are literally forcibly removing Jewish settlers who are resisting from Gaza. And that sort of led to a split within the Likud, and obviously Likud has more far-right religious, Orthodox parties that were supporting it back then. They said, hey, this isn't good. So in order to maintain his political majority, Prime Minister Sharon basically created a new party called Kadima, taking sort of the pragmatic conservatives, the centrists, center-right people from Likud to this new party and maintaining government. And that was his solution. It seemed to be working fine. Likud seemed to have weakened. They became sort of like, Likud was in disarray. But then what we have is the stroke. Ariel Sharon suffered a stroke, and he was leading this effort to create sort of a pragmatic, conservative, centrist platform that could pursue the kind of things that the traditional left could not. You needed a conservative to sort of say, hey, if I'm doing this, I'm not being soft on the Palestinians. I'm not being soft on Hamas. I know what I'm doing. That entire thing eviscerated with the stroke. And, today Kadima does not exist as a political party. It was very short-lived. That led to the revival of Likud. But Likud and Prime Minister Netanyahu, took charge of, basically came back and became the leader of Likud, and he's dominated that position since then. But what has happened is the weakening of the left and the argument about a two-state solution, the strengthening of Likud and hardening of Likud, its move further to the right, it's literally aligning with political parties that are really far right. They are sort of, in many ways, you can say that they have a very hawkish attitude towards Palestinians. They think that there shouldn't be a Palestine. They think that they should just take over Gaza, take over the West Bank, and that's the way to move forward. So, and then this political alliance tried to tinker with the judicial system. And so as long as it was on the Palestinian issue, it was controversial, but it wasn't existential for those who disagree with the political right in Israel. The political, all the opponents of Netanyahu and his right-wing alliance mobilized after he tried to go after the judiciary, and we've seen protests after protests, including from people who wear the uniform, the IDF, who basically came out and said, this is democratic erosion. This isn't about the Palestinians anymore. This is about Israel. This reality, when you have this level of political divide inside a country, then your opponents, and in this case Hamas, backed by Hezbollah and Iran, are watching this very closely and saying, how can we exploit this to our advantage? And I think that is what happened here.
What do we know or understand about the role that Likud played in bolstering the political position of Hamas vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority, that could sort of have political repercussions for them and for Netanyahu as we sort of go through this conflict now and eventually hopefully find some kind of political resolution?
Well, I think that there are two stages of this. So one stage, and it isn't just Likud, it was an Israeli policy in general. Mind you, until 1987, there was nothing called Hamas. There was a group called Mujamma al-Islamiyya, which was the name of the group led by the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, who was killed in an Israeli airstrike in 2004, that had been formed right after the Israelis took control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, mind you, Hamas its origins are in Gaza. That's its core turf. The West Bank was far more dominated by Fatah. But in those days, it was the PLO that was pushing for armed struggle. And the predecessor group to Hamas was not only not a militant organization, it was apolitical. In fact, it was encouraged by the Israeli authorities as a counterweight to the PLO back then. So this is kind of what happens with, a lot of people will go into this and say, hey, they'll delve into conspiracy theory. But reality is, look, the United States at the time when we were fighting the Soviets, we didn't know there's going to be an Al-Qaeda, much less an ISIS, or there will be a 9/11. All we knew was there's a Cold War the Soviets have breached the containment line that runs from Greece all the way to Pakistan by intervening militarily in Afghanistan. And we had to respond. And so we mobilized fighters, and we mobilized fighters who were Islamists. At that point in time in history, Islamism was something that academics talked about. What policymakers had very little interest, and it wasn't until the Iranian Revolution that happened, right about the same time. We were just sort of getting to know what Islamism is, but we thought it was an Iranian phenomenon, and it didn't really affect the Sunni world. And we supported the arming of Afghan Islamists, and then the mobilization of foreign fighters, massive mobilization. It led to, it forced the Soviets out, but we had unintended consequences. We have jihadism to deal with now. Same thing here. The Israelis did not know. They thought that this Mujamma al-Islamiyah, they knew this was the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, but they said, these guys are they're a charity group. They run mosques, they do humanitarian stuff, social work and whatnot. If we're going to counter the PLO, this may be a useful tool. You don't know that your actions have unintended consequences, and this continued. Mujamma al-Islamiyah continued well into the 80s until the first Intifada. And then these guys, now let's call them proto-Hamas, they're looking at this and saying, oh my God, the Intifada, we didn't plan for this. Our people there's an uprising going on. PLO was as surprised by it as well, because remember, the PLO was not in the territories. It had been pushed to Jordan in the early 70s. Then from there, they were pushed into Lebanon, and the 1982 invasion pushed them out of Lebanon, and they were headquartered in Tunisia, far away from the Palestinian territories, far away from Israel. So this thing caught both sides, PLO, Fatah, by surprise, and this proto-Hamas. That's when they said, hey, if we don't board this train, it's leaving without us. And that's where they decided that they will not only become political, but they'll adopt armed struggle. And by the way, by that time, if you remember, the PLO had already started to gravitate towards diplomacy and giving up armed struggle negotiations as a path to resolving the Palestinian issue. So as PLO was moving towards negotiations, that armed struggle mantle, there was a vacuum there, and Hamas filled it, along with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a much smaller faction. So that's sort of one way of how, Israel inadvertently enabled the rise of Hamas. I think afterwards, the Israeli state has been battling Hamas, first in terms of trying to, eliminate its suicide bombing capability, and since 2008, its rocket capability. So I don't know if they deliberately empowered. I can't make that argument. But what I can say is that the fact that the Palestinian issue has not been resolved. I mean, we're now what? We're about 30 years out from the Oslo Accords. And that's more than a generation. And the fact that despite all that work that was done, there isn't we don't have a solution for the Palestinians. There isn't a Palestinian state. Now, mind you that the Palestinian state is not just the inability of the Palestinians and the Israelis to negotiate a settlement. It's also the fact that the Palestinians themselves are divided. And this division emerged right after the first Intifada. So I want to be careful when I sort of assign blame. And so, yes, there is a lot of blame on the part of the Israeli right of center spectrum for really moving away from this two-state solution, and creating the conditions that then Hamas, PIJ, Hezbollah, Iran exploit, and even ISIS, if it could exploit, Al-Qaeda, if it could exploit. So that's I think that's clear that if there had been progress, we would not be today. We would not be here where we are today. And at the same time, I get the Israeli argument as well. that who do we negotiate with anymore?
And
I
who
mean,
can we depend on to provide internal security to protect us? If we're going to give autonomy over to the Palestinians, how do we know that we're going to be safe?
exactly. And I mean, the geography is so small. Imagine, you have, rocket fire from Hamas in Gaza. Do you want that to happen from the West Bank as well? No. So using empathetic analysis, the Palestinians don't have a land, don't have a state. They are suppressed. They are, they're suffering, and their suffering has been going on for a very long time. What do? They will turn to whoever. When you're suffering, when you're miserable, you'll turn to whoever appears to be, saying, "Hey, we're going to lead us out of this mess." And it's easy to be duped by characters like Hamas. Hamas is exploiting the genuine, legitimate Palestinian struggle for self-determination for its own ideological agenda. They're not, and this is one of the problems that we're having right now, is those pro-Palestinian voices that we hear today. They are, unfortunately, and it's tragic that they cannot disaggregate and disentangle Hamas's agenda from what is a genuine, legitimate Palestinian demand for self-determination. Those two have been conflated to the point now that because people are emotional. People see this. And this is the biggest tragedy in all of this, is that Hamas just murdered 1,200 Israeli citizens, and brutally. But in other words, we're in a war because of Hamas's action. It's not, yes, there's an occupation, but the occupation didn't bring us to this war. The occupation was continuing. There was a need for that resolution. But we need to recognize that Hamas, and a lot of people I know are very emotional, and they're unable to sort of say, they're disregarding at the very least what Hamas did and saying, this happened because of the occupation. So it's a very simplistic argument, and it makes the situation worse. It exacerbates tensions.
I could speak to you for hours about this part of the conversation. And I really appreciate the nuance that you brought to bear here, because indeed that is part of the problem. People dig in. I think there's also people on the pro-Palestinian side don't give enough agency to actors on that side of the conflict. And I think put too much responsibility on the Israelis. And I also always emphasize that this is such a difficult problem. A lot of times we're confronted with problems that they don't have a good political solution, but they do have a good theoretical solution. But in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even the theoretical solution is absent, or it's very difficult to understand what that would be, because of also these deep security concerns and the fact that both sides have reasons to be fearful.
I do want to add, Dimitri, one more thing, if you allow me.
Sure.
Right now, there is no, if you will, group that is championing or can champion the Palestinian struggle in an effective way. So you have Fatah, PLO, PNA, which, by the way, is led by one guy who's 87 years old. And, I can only imagine, and I shudder to think what will happen to that landscape once he's no more. And it is ineffective. It does not even control all of Palestinian territory. It is unpopular, but yet it's the internationally recognized authority amongst the Palestinians. Even now, and not that anything is wrong with it. This is exactly how the U.S. Secretary of State is supposed to behave: is to go and meet Abbas, because he has to. Even though he has very little power, he's still the nominal head of the Palestinian Authority. But that nominal reality means there's nobody championing that cause effectively. Who is trying to subvert, pervert, hijack that cause is Hamas. So if you're Palestinian, you're caught between a rock and a hard place. The devil in the deep blue sea. So the political vacuum that exists amongst the Palestinians is a key reason why there isn't any movement, and we're stuck in this sort of causality loop.
Great point. And in fact, I think you mentioned it earlier that the eventuality of Mahmoud Abbas's exit, the fact that he's 87 years old, and the political vacuum that that would create, was the impetus, or one of the impetuses, for the Abraham Accords and the desire to bring a diplomatic solution between Israel and Saudi Arabia that would involve a solution for the Palestinians. This could have been also the reason that we got this attack by Hamas. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's switch now to a conversation about intentions and what we can theorize about Hamas's intentions, and what did they, I mean, do we have any sense of whether or not they understood that, first of all, did they know there was a concert going on? Do we know anything about that? And did they expect, in your view, to have this kind of success? Or was this a kind of fortuitous slaughter of Israeli civilians that they chanced upon, and now they succeeded in ways that they didn't even imagine?
So let me start from the strategic intent and then go down to the sort of the tactical performance that we saw. The strategic intent, look, there is no way Hamas did not know that if they do this, then they are plunging the Palestinians into a very, very horrendous situation. They will be, the Israeli response will be ferocious. And this isn't just going to be like, oh, we fired some rockets, it went on for a few days or weeks, and then there was a truce. They knew that was not going to happen, yet they did it. And they don't really care for, they are, for them, the more Israel is ferocious in its response, they think it's better off in the long term. Yes, they will suffer losses in the short term, but they think it'll create the kind of crisis that could upend the regional security architecture, that could sort of create such chaos in which they think they will emerge victorious in the end. That's the same logic that Iran applies, and that is the same reason why Iran, or sort of the MO of Iran, and that's the same MO of Hezbollah. So I want this to be clear that it's not like they didn't know what they were doing. And it's not like, oh, these are a bunch of, yes, people, the people who carried it out, the recruits, the foot soldiers who are treated like cannon fodder by Hamas. They obviously aren't at that strategic level. They're the guys with the guns. They probably don't even know. In fact, there are reports now that many of them did not know what they were training for. And this is part of the tradecraft that I'm talking about, is you keep a thing a secret when you don't even tell your own people, too much, because, you fear that it'll get to the other side and you won't succeed. So, that's sort of the strategic intent here. Did they think that they were going to be successful to this extent? No. No actor is. Everything is, as you were saying earlier, Dimitri, there's the theoretical. So you do this wargaming on the drawing board and you say, hey, this is what could happen. You try to game it out as best as possible, but no battle plan, no attack, no offensive, terrorist attack, insurgent attack, conventional armed forces engaging in an operation, do not know how things will play out once, they pull the trigger. So I think that there is a strong element of what we call catastrophic success, where they weren't expecting it to be this good. Now, to answer your question, did they know about the concert that was going on, the music festival? I think it was like, what, 2.5 miles?
Very close, yeah.
Yeah. It is quite possible they knew something about it, but I don't think that they had like a whole lot of granular intelligence. So, and they must have planned for a certain degree of resistance from Israeli security forces. That they probably knew that these guys are distracted. There's a crisis going on involving the IDF. The focus is on the West Bank. We've been sending false signals. We don't want conflict. Okay. And the security over there, the security cordon, or the security, if you will, force structure, will not be what it is in times of, tension. So there's some opportunity. We'll be able to make headway. The fact that they had paragliders, the fact that they also came via the sea, and they used bulldozers, because look, when you use bulldozers, it makes a lot of noise. It alerts a lot of people. So they had to factor in that once we start this, the other side is going to kick into high gear, and we're only going to go so far. So when they were able to go in, I think it became opportunistic. I think there's a lot of, these are radicalized individuals who are willing. They know that they're going.
It would have been a suicide mission.
It is a suicide mission. You're not going to come. If you come out of this alive, you're lucky. So you're going on a suicide mission. You have to have a highly radicalized and conditioned mind for that. And usually these people are very violent. And so when they saw the opportunity, they went on a rampage. And that would sort of, nothing makes sense of this. It's inhuman, it's barbaric and savage. But I'm trying to understand the mechanics, the decision-making amongst these militants. Obviously there must have been some commanders and then followers and whatnot, and they were broken up into cells because this is a large area. You can't just sort of go from one town to the other. They had to fan out. And so they looked at this, and their radicalism drove them. They were fed hatred of Israel and Jewish people, that they went on a rampage. And unfortunately, they were able to do a lot of damage before they were, they were interdicted and forced back. But by that time, they've taken hostages. So I think that no one really knows what will happen. Actual kinetic conditions and battle space conditions, shape what you can do and what you cannot do.
So let's broaden the scope here. I don't remember exactly what words you used, but it sounded something along the lines of, we know the Iranians are involved. What do we know about the scope of Iranian involvement here? Because the administration, the Biden administration, and the Israeli government have both come out saying that we don't know if the Iranians were involved. Yes, Kirby said that Iranians are complicit in the fact that they have ties to Hamas, they help fund terrorist operations, etc. But do we know as a fact that they were directly involved in this operation? No, we don't. What is your view on the nature of Iran's involvement here, and what is the nature of that knowledge?
So that's a great question. As someone who's been studying Iran for a very long time, I can tell you that, and this isn't just Iran, this is sort of the nature of the intelligence and special operations business. There's a report out there that says, at least there's one report, if not more, that the U.S. intelligence detected surprise on the part of Iranian officials when they found out about it. So this was a counter to the Wall Street Journal report of Hamas and Hezbollah guys and even Iranians saying, hey, we were involved. I took it as a deliberate leak to shape perceptions. And so this Washington Post report was, hey, we have administration people saying, we have no evidence. On the contrary, everything we know from our intelligence, listening posts is that the Iranian leadership, when they found out about it, they were surprised. Now,
and publicly also the Iranians denied it publicly as well.
Well, nobody will ever say that we did this. Although the Iranian foreign minister meeting with Hamas leaders in Qatar is like, you're basically saying without
hugging
saying
and kissing. There's a video online circulating.
And those high fives and whatnot. You're basically saying that yes, we did it. We're just not saying it. Okay. So, but anyway, let's go back to that intelligence. Who is being watched? Okay. Whose phone is being tapped? Who is under surveillance? Which leader? Because that matters. There's no way an operation of this kind will be known by Khamenei himself. He's way up there. It's a need-to-know basis kind of.
Khamenei is the supreme leader.
The supreme leader. Let's even drop down. Did the president know? Did his defense minister know? Interior minister know? His intelligence minister know? I doubt it. Who knew? It's not even the leadership of the IRGC.
The IRGC is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
The Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the elite ideological military force. And mind you, there is a parallel military force, which is more professional, less ideological, the regular armed forces. And they're a much bigger entity than the IRGC. Within the IRGC, we know that the Quds Force,
which used to be headed by Soleimani, who the Trump administration took out several years ago.
Exactly. We know that because look, it's like this. You have a corporate entity, you have a government. Who is designated as the interface, as the manager of, in this case, Hamas? I mean, this isn't going to be done by the top leadership. So if you're listening to the foreign minister's phone, or you're listening to, someone even high up in the IRGC, chances are you're only going so deep into that leadership structure. This kind of operation is known by Soleimani's successor, Ismail Qani, Brigadier General Ismail Qani, who, because Soleimani was sort of this, he was made out to be this larger than life figure, and so he has big shoes to fill. So he needs to demonstrate that, hey, this Quds force, I can lead it, and I'm not sort of like I wasn't sort of like one of the proverbial deputies to Soleimani. So he has to take charge on this, but even he is basically managing the Iraqi Shiite militias, the relationship with the Taliban, which is his experience, which is his expertise, while Soleimani was dealing with the Arab world, this guy was dealing with the Eastern Front. There's the Assad regime that needs to be supported. There are Shiite militias that are in Syria that need to be maintained. There is Hezbollah, that relationship needs to be maintained. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen. This is all his portfolio. So operationally, he can only know so much, okay? He has, subordinates who are dealing with the tactical on a day-to-day basis. So imagine you're sitting in the Supreme National Security Council meeting in Tehran. You have the president, the supreme leader, the IRGC, the regular armed forces, everybody, in that top political and military leadership is there. What are they discussing? Are they discussing a plan to attack Israel? That would be bad tradecraft if they did that, because they have to assume that they're being listened into, or at least parts of it. So they are at that level. They say, yes, we need to support Hamas. How much money do you need? Here is we will authorize it, and off you go. And then it's the Quds Force commander Qani's job to make it happen. Now, then who's planning this? Who's training? Who's providing that tradecraft? Where is it taking place? So this is are we listening to the right people when we say that, hey, they express surprise? So I think there's nuance and granularity here that is really, really missed in the conversation. There is another element to this, that the Biden administration has been negotiating with these guys, and they have an interest in, whether it's the Biden administration or a Republican administration. When you're in office, you don't want war. Okay, there's already a war. You have Ukraine. Now you have Hamas starting another war, and it can get out of hand. You don't want war. So chances are there's a political imperative to sort of say, hey, you know what? Yes, the Iranians are involved, but we don't know, and it's safe to say that we don't know, and we'll dig deeper into it, but not right now. Right now, we want to be able to make sure this thing doesn't get out of hand. So in all these imperatives, in all these pursuits, the idea, the conversation of who knew when, what, who was involved, that conversation gets muddled. It takes place amongst us analysts and people who are studying this phenomenon, and in the conversations that I'm having with you, but it's compartmentalized at the government level, if that makes sense.
Sure. I don't know if there will be time in the second hour, if this is really a conversation for a whole nother podcast, to look at and examine and help the audience understand where power resides in Iran, how that power is divided in ways that are very different than in the United States, and also the sort of the mission of the Quds Force in spreading revolution throughout the region. I can only imagine the kind of paranoia that must be overtaking the Israeli government at this present time, considering the intelligence failures here, and they're sort of at this point questioning everything. Do you think that's kind of where they're at this moment in time? They don't know what to believe. They don't know the scope of the strategy here. And then to that point, as we're talking about strategy, maybe the next question is, so one question is, I'm curious just your thoughts on what is going on right now in the cabinet in Israel. And then the other one is, what do you think the strategy here is? If this was something that was directed by Iran, what is the overall strategy? What is the end game here?
Okay, those are a bunch of different questions, and so I'm going to go through them one at a time. So I think that if you are Israel, and before this attack happened, your reputation, your self-confidence as a very sophisticated intelligence entity, Mossad, and the whole community, the whole Israeli intelligence community, IDF, Intel, Shabak, Shin Bet, all of that, was that you were on top of your game. The reason for that is that you even have an overwatch over what the Iranians and the Quds Force are doing in Syria, hence the airstrikes from time to time. And the interdiction of weapons shipments, fighters and whatnot. You keep Iran off base. And on top of that, you have deeply penetrated Iran itself. The elimination of nuclear scientists, the attacks on nuclear facilities. So you're really brimming with confidence. Then all of a sudden this happens. And you say, while we were focusing on these long distance threats,
and I'm on the verge of peace, of a historic peace with Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. We dropped the ball. We took our eye off the ball in Gaza, where we needed to know. In other words, while we had the Iranians penetrated, they circumvented us and found a way to hit us back. And we were caught,
with our britches down.
Yeah, I mean, basically sleeping on the job, if you want to be, blunt about it. So now, obviously, there's not just paranoia, there's a loss of confidence. And why does this matter? This matters because so this is the problem with the intelligence services and intelligence failures, is that once there's a failure, then that same entity has to take you out of failure and towards success. So it's a paradoxical situation. An entity that whose intelligence, whose net assessments you can no longer are not now suspect, you're asking them to say, what will it look like when we go into Gaza? What else do we know about what the Iranians are up to? I have to assume, Dimitri, that Hamas didn't do this knowing that it would be hit hard like never before without any planning. Mm-hmm. They have some planning going on. That's what the Israelis need to know right now. What's that planning? And then is Iran going to just sit back and say, hey, it was nice knowing you? You're on your own, guys. No. What do they have planned? That hence the second front. Hence the whole thing about Lebanon. Hence the two aircraft carrier groups, the carrier strike groups that are now, I think it was yesterday that the USS Eisenhower left Norfolk for the Eastern Mediterranean. There's a reason for all of that, because you don't know. And that is what those are sort of the tactical and strategic implications of intelligence failure. So I think at this point, the Israeli cabinet is focused on, how do we square this circle? We need those hostages. We need to secure those hostages and get them back safely. We need to, destroy Hamas. We need to make sure that there's not a whole lot of Palestinian life that is, lost in the process. That's just going to make it even worse for us. And I mean, if you're Prime Minister Netanyahu, you are now assuming my political career is over. I'm not going to come out of this. He can't assume that he can fix all of this. So he's assuming it's over. Now I just need to not be remembered as the guy who completely, messed things up. I had divided the nation. Under my watch, Israel was attacked by Hamas. Iran has found loopholes into our system. I will be remembered for this forever. So he's trying to minimize damage to his legacy. And so these are sort of the very human frailties, both in terms of decision-making and, quite frankly, capability, that are constraining the Israelis. And it leads to making mistakes more because you're under intense pressure. You have the Biden administration saying to you, and if I had to guess, the Biden administration is the conversation that, look, the readouts will not say this, but the real conversation that's happening is, we know you need to go in and destroy Hamas. We support you on that. Make sure that this doesn't get messy, because if it does, then we're going to have a hard time supporting you. Even today, the president's statement has kind of shifted. This morning, he said, we need to care about Palestinian lives, and he's getting criticized for that, saying, oh, it's, you're late in the game. You should have said this before the airstrikes began.
What an incredibly insightful analysis. I really love what you had to say about Netanyahu. It's something that I hadn't even considered, and it's a perspective that I think is just invaluable. I also think when I think about the paranoia and the loss of trust in the intelligence that they're getting, I also think about what risks they're not willing to take in Gaza, and will that result in them using air power much more than they would their actual military, and how that feeds into the propaganda war, which also gets us into a conversation about the nature of propaganda and media and public relations today versus what it has been in the past, which is just something I think, we could touch on in the second hour. I'm going to move us to that part of the conversation, and I want to give people a sense of where I want to focus that discussion. I do want to continue this conversation about Iran because I want to understand also the complexity of the threat environment that Israel faces. What it would look like for a second front to open up in the north with Hezbollah, and what you imagine the Americans are prepared to do in that situation, and how this could really escalate. What are sort of some of the worst case scenarios, as well as what are some of the better case scenarios? How could this de-escalate? That's where I'd want to take us in the second hour. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Kamran, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Kamran, stick around. We're going to move the second hour of our conversation onto the premium feed.